A fearless teenage girl, Emily Taylor, steps into the courtroom to fight a case that no one believes she can win. What starts as a simple fight for justice soon unravels into a massive conspiracy, exposing corruption at the highest levels. Powerful forces try to silence her, threats, cover-ups, even government interference. But Emily refuses to back down. With the whole world watching, will she defeat the system designed to crush her? Or will she become its next victim? Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. If this story hooked you in, imagine what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Like this video, share it with your friends, and let's spread the truth together. The tension in the courtroom is suffocating. All eyes are on a lone figure standing at the defendant's table. Emily Taylor, a teenage girl who has no business challenging the legal titans before her. Judge Harold Carver leans back in his towering chair, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You mean to tell me," he says, barely suppressing a chuckle, "that you, a high school student, intend to debate constitutional law in my courtroom?" Laughter erupts from the spectators, rippling through the chamber like a cruel wave. But Emily doesn't flinch. She tightens her grip on the podium, her voice steady as steel. "Your Honor," she says, meeting his gaze without fear, "this case isn't just about me. It's about justice, and I intend to prove it." The room falls silent. No one realizes it yet, but everything is about to change. 6 months earlier, Emily Taylor was just another high school student in Willow Creek, California, brilliant but unnoticed, drifting through the hallways like a shadow. Her world revolved around textbooks, late-night study sessions, and the rhythmic bounce of a basketball on the court. She was smart, top of her class, but in a town where names carried weight, intelligence alone wasn't enough to stand out. Her father, Daniel Taylor, was different. A seasoned civil rights attorney, he spent his days fighting battles that most people ignored. At the dinner table, he would tell stories of injustice, of people silenced by a system built against them. Emily listened, fascinated, but never imagined herself stepping into that world, until one day, a single case changed everything. That evening, Daniel Taylor sat at the kitchen table, his face lined with exhaustion. His once steady hands trembled as he rubbed his temples, staring at the stack of legal documents before him. Emily watched from the doorway, sensing the weight pressing down on her father. "Tough case?" she asked, setting down a plate of reheated lasagna in front of him. Daniel sighed, barely looking up. "More than tough. It's a losing battle, Em." Emily frowned. Her father had spent his life standing up for people who had no voice. He never called a fight impossible. "What's wrong?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "The school board is burying it. It's about a girl in Riverside County who was denied admission to her local school because of a technicality. Her parents couldn't afford a lawyer, so I took the case pro bono. But the school board's attorneys are tearing it apart before we even get a hearing." Emily's stomach tightened. "But that's unfair? Illegal?" "Yeah," her father muttered. "But that doesn't seem to matter." That night, unable to shake the feeling of injustice, Emily wandered into her father's study. Dusty books lined the shelves, decades of legal history at her fingertips. She ran her fingers across the spines, stopping at a thick, worn-out law book. She flipped it open, and there it was. A Supreme Court ruling, buried in old pages, a precedent that could turn everything around. Her father's case wasn't hopeless. An idea sparked, a bold, reckless, and nearly impossible idea. The kitchen was silent except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. Emily stood across from her father, hands clenched into fists. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "I'll argue the case." Daniel Taylor, a seasoned civil rights attorney, blinked as if he hadn't heard her correctly. Then he let out a sharp laugh, dry and humorless. "Emily, this isn't a school debate. This is court. A courtroom full of people who will eat you alive the second you stumble. I won't stumble. She swallowed, the nerves tightening in her throat. I've read everything. I found a precedent, Dad. An old Supreme Court ruling that proves the school board is violating constitutional law. Daniel ran a hand through his graying hair. That's not the point. You have no legal experience. You're a teenager. Emily stepped forward, determination burning in her eyes. Dad, you always say that the law belongs to everyone, not just those with degrees. That it's about standing up for what's right, no matter who you are. So let me stand up for her. Her father stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, rubbing his temples. You don't understand what you're walking into, Em. Courtrooms aren't fair. They'll tear you apart. Emily met his gaze, unwavering. Let them try. This wasn't just about a case anymore. It was about proving that justice wasn't reserved for the powerful, and no matter what, she would not back down. Emily had spent months buried in legal books, debating late into the night with her father, and practicing arguments in front of the mirror until her voice was raw. She knew every law, every precedent, and every possible counter-argument. But none of that prepared her for the pressure of stepping into a real courtroom. As she walked in, the air was thick with tension. Reporters lined the back of the room, cameras flashing. The gallery was packed, lawyers, journalists, even students from her own school whispering among themselves. And at the center of it all, towering behind the bench, was Judge Harold Carver. His sharp gaze swept over Emily, assessing, judging. She swallowed hard, but refused to show fear. Miss Taylor, Judge Carver said, his voice laced with condescension, you have the floor. Emily took a steady breath and stepped forward. She met his gaze, squared her shoulders, and spoke. This case is about more than just one student being denied an education, she began, her voice clear and strong. It's about whether we uphold the principles of fairness and justice, or allow them to be buried beneath bureaucracy and discrimination. A murmur ran through the audience. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. She was just gaining momentum when, BAM! The doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A man in a dark suit strode in, his face pale, his expression urgent. He walked straight to the clerk, whispered something, and handed over a sealed envelope. Judge Carver's expression darkened. He took the envelope, read its contents, then looked up, his gaze locking onto Emily with something that sent a chill down her spine. This court will recess immediately, he announced, slamming his gavel down. There has been a significant development in this case. Chaos erupted. The gallery exploded with whispers. Reporters rushed for the exits, and Emily stood frozen at the podium, heart pounding. She turned to her father. Dad, what just happened? His face was grim. I don't know, Em, he muttered, but whatever it is, it's big. The tension in the courtroom was already high, but when the federal agent stormed in, everything changed. The man in the dark suit, tall and imposing, flashed his badge as he strode toward the judge's bench. A hush fell over the room as he handed Judge Carver a folder stamped classified. The judge flipped it open, scanning the contents, and for the first time since the trial began, his expression flickered, first with surprise, then something that almost looked like concern. What's the meaning of this? Carver demanded, his voice sharp. The agent cleared his throat. Your Honor, I'm Agent Nolan Carter, Department of Justice. The evidence in this file pertains directly to this case. He turned, his piercing gaze locking onto Emily. And it goes far beyond what this court is prepared to handle. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What does that mean? Judge Carver exhaled, rubbing his temple as he closed the folder. Then he slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing through the chamber. This court is in recess. All parties are ordered to remain in the building until further notice. Chaos erupted. Lawyers whispered in hushed urgency, reporters scrambled for their phones, and Emily turned to her father, her pulse racing. "Dad," she said, gripping his arm, "what's happening?" Her father's jaw was tight, his eyes dark with worry. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever this is, it's bigger than we ever imagined." Emily sat at the kitchen table, poring over legal documents when her phone buzzed. She reached for it absent-mindedly until she saw the unknown number. Her stomach clenched. She hesitated, then opened the message. "Drop the case or face the consequences." Her hands went cold. The words glowed ominously on the screen, sharp and final. She looked up at her father, who was already watching her with a knowing expression. "What's wrong?" he asked. Before she could answer, his phone rang. He checked the caller ID, the shelter where their key witness was staying. When he answered, the frantic voice on the other end sent a chill down Emily's spine. "The shelter! There was a fire!" the woman on the phone gasped. It's bad." Emily's heart dropped. They raced to the scene, sirens wailing in the distance. Smoke still curled into the sky, the charred remains of the shelter barely standing. Their witness, a former school administrator who had come forward with damning evidence, was nowhere to be found. Emily clenched her fists, her pulse roaring in her ears. "This isn't a coincidence." Her father put a firm hand on her shoulder. "No," he said grimly. "It's a warning." Emily turned away from the destruction, her fear hardening into resolve. "They want me to back down." She exhaled sharply. "But I'm not going anywhere." Emily sat in the courtroom, her pulse steady despite the storm brewing around her. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered. Her case had exploded into a national firestorm overnight. The whistleblower's leak had changed everything. Confidential emails, secret memos, and internal documents, all pointing to a deliberate conspiracy to keep low-income students out of certain schools. The evidence was undeniable. The judge's gavel slammed. "Order in the court." Then came the defense's next move. A high-powered lobbyist took the stand, his presence sending a ripple through the room. James Collier, a name whispered in political circles, was here to rewrite the truth. He adjusted his tie, eyes gleaming with polished confidence. "Your Honor, this case is nothing more than a misguided attack on the education system." His voice was smooth, persuasive, a man used to twisting reality to suit his needs. Emily's jaw tightened. He presented cherry-picked data, carefully crafted statements, painting the whistleblower as a rogue employee with a vendetta. The judge listened, but the jury, they weren't convinced. Emily saw it in their faces. Her father leaned over. "They're scrambling." She nodded. The truth was out now, and no amount of spin could bury it. Collier smirked as he finished. "Let's not let conspiracy theories cloud the integrity of our institutions." Emily stood, stepping forward. "Integrity?" Her voice was calm, but her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we don't have conspiracy theories. We have receipts." The audience gasped. The real fight was only beginning. Emily sat rigid in her seat as Nancy Whitaker, the defense attorney, rose with a smirk. She held a thick legal document in her hands. Their next move was about to unfold. "Your Honor," Whitaker began, her voice dripping with calculated confidence, "we respectfully file a motion to dismiss Miss Taylor from these proceedings." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Emily's hands clenched into fists under the table. Judge Harold Carver adjusted his glasses, his gaze narrowing. "On what grounds?" Whitaker's smirk widened. "Respectfully, Your Honor, she is a high school student with no legal qualifications. Her involvement in this case is an insult to the integrity of the judicial system. Courtrooms are not a place for amateur theatrics." Emily felt a flash of anger, but she forced herself to stay composed. This was their play, to make her seem incompetent, to humiliate her into backing down. The judge turned to Emily. "Miss Taylor, do you have a response?" She rose slowly, her heartbeat steady. They wanted to break her, but they underestimated her. "Your Honor," she said, voice unwavering. I may not have a law degree, but I have the facts. And the truth doesn't require credentials to be heard. Murmurs filled the courtroom. The audience was shifting. Emily turned to Whitaker. You say I don't belong here, yet I'm the one who exposed a statewide scandal that your clients desperately want to bury. Whitaker's expression darkened. Emily continued, locking eyes with the judge. This isn't about my age. It's about whether this court is willing to let corruption go unchecked simply because the person exposing it isn't qualified enough. Silence fell over the room. The judge tapped his gavel. Motion denied. Miss Taylor will continue her argument. A surge of victory coursed through Emily. Whitaker sat down, her jaw tight. The system was against her. The odds were stacked. But Emily Taylor wasn't leaving this courtroom without a fight. The courtroom was already tense, but what happened next shook the entire nation. A news alert flashed on every screen. An anonymous whistleblower had leaked an audio recording. The voice on the tape? None other than James Collier, the high-powered lobbyist linked to the school board and top government officials. Make sure the case never reaches a ruling. Collier's voice crackled through the speakers. If the judge won't play along, we apply pressure. If Emily Taylor keeps pushing, we bury her in motions and bureaucracy until she breaks. The public can never know how deep this goes. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Journalists scrambled to take notes. The entire cover-up was exposed. The corruption, the intimidation, the lengths they were willing to go to silence Emily and protect their empire. Judge Harold Carver, who had been skeptical of Emily from the start, leaned forward, his face pale. Even he couldn't ignore this now. The defense team panicked. Whitaker stood up, her voice shaking. Your Honor, we need time to assess the validity of this so-called evidence. But before she could finish, the courtroom doors flew open. A stern-faced official in a dark suit strode in, handing the judge a sealed document. Judge Carver's hands trembled as he read the words. The State Attorney General's office is issuing a formal intervention, he announced. This case is now under official review, and all proceedings are suspended, effective immediately. The room exploded into chaos. Emily froze. After all the battles, all the risks she had taken, just when the truth was finally out, they were shutting it down. Her father grabbed her arm. Emily, listen to me. They know they're losing. That's why they're doing this, but we're not done yet. She took a deep breath, her anger turning into resolve. If the system wouldn't listen inside the courtroom, she'd take the fight outside. Emily Taylor was not backing down. Emily sat in her father's study, staring at the legal notice in her hands. The State Attorney General's office had frozen the case indefinitely. They're stalling, her father said, pacing the room, hoping the public will forget, hoping you'll give up. But Emily wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. She looked at the stacks of documents, the audio recordings, the emails, all the evidence they had uncovered. If the courtroom was no longer an option, she had only one choice left: take the truth to the world. Her father hesitated. Once you do this, there's no going back, Emily. They will come after you harder than ever. She met his gaze, her voice firm. Then let them. That night, Emily went live. Sitting in front of the camera, her hands didn't shake, her voice didn't waver. My name is Emily Taylor, she began, staring directly into the lens, and I need you to hear the truth. She laid it all out: the rigged court system, the corrupt officials, the corporate greed, the documents that proved the cover-up, and the threats she had received. The world listened. Within minutes, the live stream exploded. Within hours, it dominated the headlines. Within a day, protests had erupted across the country. The Attorney General's office was bombarded with calls for an investigation. And then, the unthinkable happened. A second whistleblower came forward. More damning evidence was released. Government officials scrambled. The Attorney General was forced to hold a press conference, claiming they would review the case immediately. Emily had forced their hand. She sat back, watching the chaos unfold, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to smile. They had tried to silence her. They had failed. The streets were flooded with protesters, their voices shaking the foundations of the institutions that had tried to silence the truth. Signs reading, "Justice for students," and "End the corruption," filled the air. Emily watched the news from her father's office, exhausted but unshaken. She had started a fire, and it was spreading. Lawmakers were forced to respond. Some scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, while others called for immediate reforms. The media was relentless, exposing more hidden truths about the education system's corrupt foundations. Then, the final revelation landed. A government insider leaked classified documents, proof that the exclusionary policies weren't just random acts of discrimination. They were deliberate, coordinated, and had been in place for decades. This wasn't just about one case. This was a systemic conspiracy. Emily could almost taste victory. But then, her enemies made their last, desperate move. A lawsuit was filed against her. The state attorney general's office accused her of illegally obtaining and distributing confidential government records. "They're trying to turn you into the criminal," her father muttered, slamming a folder shut. A warrant was issued for the whistleblower. The media narrative began to shift, with headlines asking, "Did Emily Taylor cross the line?" For the first time, doubt crept in. Had she gone too far? Had she put too many people at risk? But then she saw it, the millions of people still standing with her. She took a deep breath. No matter what they threw at her, she wasn't backing down. This war was far from over. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, suffocating. The world was watching, waiting for the final decision that could reshape the future. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clenched together, barely breathing as Judge Harold Carver shuffled the papers before him. His face was unreadable. "For weeks, this court has heard arguments from both sides," the judge began, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. "This case has become more than a legal battle. It has become a fight for the very principles of justice and equal opportunity in this country." A pause. A heartbeat of eternity. "The court rules in favor of the plaintiff." The words hit like a lightning bolt. The courtroom exploded into chaos, gasps, cheers, stunned silence. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She turned to her father, who was already pulling her into a hug. "You did it," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. The judge banged his gavel. "Furthermore," he continued, his tone sharper, more resolute, "this court is recommending an immediate federal investigation into the systemic corruption uncovered throughout these proceedings." The defense team looked shattered. Nancy Whitaker, the once arrogant school board attorney, sat frozen in disbelief. But Emily wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the crowd, at the students, the parents, the activists who had fought alongside her. This victory wasn't just hers, it belonged to them all. As she stepped outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted over each other, but she didn't need to hear the questions. She had one thing to say. This is just the beginning. The gavel had fallen, the verdict had been read, but the storm was far from over. Emily stood outside the courthouse, the roar of the crowd surrounding her. Protesters, students, activists, all chanting her name. The ruling wasn't just a victory. It was a spark that set an entire movement ablaze. Her father stood beside her, pride in his eyes. "You changed everything," he murmured. Emily shook her head. "We changed everything." Inside, the defeated opposition scrambled, already plotting their next move. Corrupt officials wouldn't go down without a fight. The system didn't break in a day, and it wouldn't be fixed overnight. But out here, in the streets, in the hearts of people watching from across the country, something new had begun. That night, Emily lay on her rooftop, staring at the sky, the weight of everything finally sinking in. This battle was won. But the war for justice, for truth, for every student who had been denied their chance, that war was only just beginning. The battle for justice doesn't end here. This is just the beginning of a movement that challenges corruption and fights for what's right. If you believe in truth, fairness, and standing up against powerful forces, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe now. Every voice matters, and together, we can make a difference. Drop a comment below. Do you think justice was truly served? Let's keep this conversation going.